In the vast crystalline dome of the Galactic Council, judgment was passed with impunity. Species far older than humans sat on pedestals of ancient bureaucracy, cloaked in ceremonial robes and hidden behind translator drones. At the center of this great political machine stood one lone human ambassador, Reese Calder, and stone-faced and silent as the verdict was read. For decades, humanity had been the wild card in the galactic order. They expanded too fast. Our colonies ignored council boundaries. Their defiance of protocols, refusal to adopt standard technology, stubborn refusal to integrate into the council's cultural expectations had made them a thorn in the side. Of galactic order, wars had been considered. Embargoes attempted, but nothing worked. Earth didn't fold. It adapted. Even when fleets blockaded trade, humans built internal economies. Even when their ships were banned from warp gates, they found alternate paths, slower but dependable, so the Council chose a different solution. Let them vanish. The judgment was delivered by High Arbiter Valerizon, a massive crystalline entity whose species hadn't known emotion in millennia. She declared humanity to be irredeemably disruptive to galactic harmony. And thus, a sentence of forced relocation was past 8 million human settlers, chosen from Earth's outer colonies, were to be exiled to CX-9471, a dead planet on the edge of the known galaxy. No protest was allowed. No appeal accepted. The punishment was more elegant than war. No blood spilled, no ships burned, just quiet removal. To the Council, it was mercy masquerading as banishment. CX-9471 had been surveyed only once. It was a world of jagged rock, sub-zero temperatures, constant windstorms, and an atmosphere laced with chemicals no standard respirator could handle. Worse still, its soil was biologically inert and capable of supporting even the hardiest alien crops. The surface storms shattered metal, the radiation flares overloaded electronics, and the planet lacked natural fuel sources. To the Council, it was a slow, clean execution. They would die of cold, of starvation, of despair. But in the Council chamber, Ambassador Calderon didn't react. No outrage, no trembling, no tears. He simply nodded once and said, "Understood." That was the last anyone in the core worlds heard from him. Within a week, the forced migration began. Ships mostly decommissioned human freighters were loaded, with settlers, engineers, farmers, doctors, scientists, soldiers. No weapons, no aid, no advanced council equipment. They weren't allowed to bring climate domes, terraforming tools, or seed banks. It's just what they could carry. Families kissed Earth. Goodbye from orbit. Children stared through thick ship glass at the shrinking blue marble. Some cried, most did not. There was a grim resolve in their eyes. The Council expected rebellion, but none came. The journey took months. CX-9471 didn't have warp gates or jump beacons. The ships drifted into orbit over a planet that looked like a scar across space-black clouds, lightning streaks, volcanic mountain ranges laced with frozen valleys, and still no one protested. The humans disembarked. The ships left orbit, some piloted by Council enforcers, others by AI set to self-destruct after departure, and then silence. CX-9471 was forgotten. The Council turned its gaze elsewhere. Political squabbles, economic forecasts, trade disagreements, more familiar, controllable matters. They told themselves the problem was gone. The humans would vanish quietly into the frost. They hadn't understood the species they were dealing with, because what the Council had delivered wasn't a death sentence, it was a challenge. And if there was one thing humanity never ignored, it was a challenge. Within weeks of landing, settlers had already begun mapping geothermal hotspots, erecting makeshift shelters with heteroflective materials, and recycling atmosphere with hand-built purifiers. The planet was a nightmare, but they weren't strangers to nightmares. Earth itself had once tried to kill them 1,000 ways. Now CX-9471 would learn what Earth had learned long ago. Humans don't die easy. Not when there's something left to build. Not when there's a chance to prove someone wrong. And especially not when someone tried to bury them. The first winter on CX-9471 nearly wiped him out, with temperatures plummeting below -80 degrees Celsius during solar night cycles and constant chemical storms sweeping across the landscape. The initial settlement, named Anchorhold, lost nearly 40% of its population in the first 3 months. Exposure, starvation, equipment failure, despair. The Galactic Council, monitoring from distant probes, took this as confirmation. The sentence was working. But what the Council didn't see, what their satellites failed to interpret, was the moment the humans adapted. They dug deeper. CX-9471. Single quotes, "Us surface was death, but beneath it there was heat, faint but constant geothermal activity. Seismic sensors deployed by engineers located natural heat vents, and miners dug tunnels into the crust. They melted ice to get water, used heat to create hydroponic chambers in airtight caverns, and built homes into the rock itself. Layered with insulation and emergency airlocks, they called these first underground shelters warrens. They weren't pretty. They weren't comfortable. But they were alive. And in the center of Anchorhold's main cavern, for the first time in almost half a year, someone lit an open flame, the first fire. It wasn't symbolic, it was survival. They had harnessed geothermal energy to create a central heat and light source that wouldn't kill them. Children who hadn't seen warmth in weeks gathered around it, their frozen skin thawing as laughter replaced sobs. People cooked their first warm meal. They breathed purified air and listened to music played over salvaged speakers. From that fire, a new spirit was born, not just of survival, but reclamation.
Ow.
The settlers looked at this hell world and saw opportunity. As Anchorhold stabilized, scouting teams were dispatched to explore and map further geothermal nodes. They found frozen rivers of heavy metals and entire caves of breathable mineral pockets. They gathered samples of native moss clinging to rock, barely alive but thriving. In chemical darkness, these weren't signs of life. They were invitations to push forward. Engineers like Tobias Wren built makeshift power generators using scavenged thermoelectric plates. Biologists like Dr. Lena Coe began testing soil samples, reintroducing modified earth bacteria to kickstart microbial ecosystems. They isolated rare isotopes that made ideal fuel for small fusion cells. Slowly, deliberately, the settlers turned environmental poison into renewable potential. They weren't just surviving now, they were learning. In year 3, the first agriculture dome went online, called Eden 1, built from salvaged hull. Panels, transparent aluminum sheets, and pressure-sealed polymer. The dome housed a vertical farm using genetically modified fungus, edible algae, and nutrient gel vats. It fed 40 people by year 5. There were 10 such domes, feeding thousands. CX-9471 wasn't healing. It was still hostile, still vicious. But humans didn't need peace. They needed time. Time to fight the planet into submission. Time to innovate their way out of extinction. And while the Council expected failure, humans began setting records. No civilization had ever survived on CX-9471. No species had ever built without aid. No race had ever turned a class red death world into a functioning settlement. But by year 6, humanity had done all 3. Perhaps most importantly, children were being born. Weren't crying from cold. They were running through pressurized corridors. They didn't know Earth. They didn't speak of exile. Their first words were in the dialect of New Terraficient, clipped, filled with technical slang and survivalist pride. These children weren't just colonists. They were natives. The first generation to grow up thinking of CX-9471 not as a punishment, but as home. Meanwhile, the rest of the galaxy remained ignorant of what was happening beneath the crust. Council sensors high in orbit read muted energy signatures, interpreted them as decay. They saw no radio transmissions, no trade, no distress calls. They assumed silence meant death. But the silence was intentional, because humanity hadn't. Forgotten, they remembered the verdict, the exile, Smug faces at the council chamber, and they had no intention of begging for mercy. They would build, they would thrive, and when the time came, they would speak again, not to plead. By year 12, humanity had done more than survive. They had transformed. X-9471, no longer just a cold tomb of acid winds and frozen rock. The planet now colloquially called New Terra was a web of underground cities, shielded transport tunnels, and geothermal power lines. Their settlements weren't fragile outposts, they were fortresses of ingenuity. They'd learned how to tame the toxic atmosphere. Where once they used jury-rigged air purifiers patched together with old freighter parts, they now ran atmospheric processors that scrubbed poison and pumped breathable oxygen into vast underground reservoirs. Biologists and chemists developed hardy organisms, genetically spliced fungi, carbon-crunching bacteria. Algae adapted to thrive in chemical slurry that not only survived but created usable resources. But the outside world still believed them dead. The Galactic Council had long stopped checking. Satellite scans, though passive, showed low energy levels interpreted as slow planetary decay. To the Council, CX-9471 had been buried along with the last of the troublesome humans until the day the sky spoke, at precisely 7:42 local time on the 12th anniversary of settlement. New Terra launched a satellite. They named it Echo 1. It wasn't large. It wasn't weaponized. It carried no flags, no warnings, just one message, broadcast across every open galactic frequency. We live. 3 words. That was all. But across the galaxy, it was as if a ghost had whispered into a crowded room. Panic erupted in Council. Systems. A dozen scout drones were immediately dispatched to verify the signal. They expected wreckage. Maybe one surviving facility. A few hundred scavengers. What they found changed everything. The drones barely made it into orbit. Before they were intercepted, not destroyed, but caught in a gravity net, decelerated, disabled, and returned.
No damage, no retaliation, just a...
Second message, this time more pointed. We thrive. That one hit harder, because live implied survival. Thrive implied progress. The Council called emergency meetings. Political factions blamed one another. How had humans survived? Had they been secretly aided? Had smugglers supplied them? Had another species broken exile protocol? No evidence pointed to outside help. They had done it alone, and now the galaxy had to reckon with that. Alien media began to buzz with speculation. News feeds ran simulations of New Terra's climate and screamed that it was impossible. Scientists demanded data. Xenobiologists argued over how humans could re-engineer entire ecosystems without galactic technology, and then the third message arrived this time, encoded in over 50 alien dialects. No aid, no trade, no help.
Thought you gave us the kill.
US, we turned into our foundation. This wasn't just survival, it was defiance. A slap in the face of the Council's pride. On New Terra, the people had known the time would come. They'd worked for years in silence, perfecting their own technology. Not stolen, not copied, but built from necessity. Systems more efficient than Council equivalents, adapted for extreme conditions. Machines powered by geothermal and chemical reactions, weapons integrated with mining tools. Data systems that ran on hardline quantum meshes rather than galactic relays. Humanity didn't wait for a welcome. They built their own future. And now that they had a voice again, used it not to seek forgiveness, but to warn. Across New Terra. The words of the first signal were carved into alloy walls, broadcast in schools, etched into military crests. They meant it as a death sentence. We took it as a challenge. To the children born under artificial suns, those words were truth. To the veterans of the early years, they were vindication. To the Council, they were a proclaimer. Reminder that the species they had tried to erase hadn't just endured. It had evolved. For the first time in a decade. Council patrol ships tried to enter the CX-9471 system. None succeeded. Not because they were fired upon, but because they were turned away. Human defense satellites cobbled together, yes, but sharp. Fast and terrifyingly efficient, formed a net around New Terra. They bore no flags. No threats. Just warning beacons in over 100 languages. You exiled us. You do not get to visit. The rest of the galaxy stood at a crossroads. Some species, ignored or colonized, began reaching out, curious, not to the council, but toward the shadows where the humans lived. Smugglers whispered tales of cities buried in fireglass caverns. Refugees spoke of powerful machines built from scrap, of engineers who could make air out of poison. But the council, they remained silent. For the first time in memory, they were afraid of what came next, because humanity had survived exile, and they were only just beginning to speak. The 25th year since exile began not with silence, but with ignition. A ship sleek, functional, unmistakably human, rose from New Terra's surface and punched through the atmosphere on fusion thrusters that screamed defiance. There were no sponsors, no galactic markings, no transponder compatible with Council registries. It was the first vessel built entirely on CX-9471, and its course was set for the galactic core. For the first time in over 2 decades, humanity was returning not to beg for re-entry or appeal the sentence, but to speak on their terms. The ship, named Resolute Dawn, was captained by Mara Idris, a child born underground beneath steel domes and geothermal lights. She had never set foot on Earth. Her skin bore the pale tint of recycled air and artificial light. Her hands were calloused, not from war, from building. She was not a product of old humanity. She was the future it had forged. As Resolute Dawn neared the galactic core, every news channel in the galaxy lit up. Speculation ran wild. Some believed the ship was a declaration of war. Others thought it carried proof of Council betrayal. Few feared it was a bomb. The Council debated furiously. Many wanted to intercept. Some urged immediate disintegration. But cooler minds prevailed. "Let them speak," one elder drone said. "Let them show us how low they've sunk." But the Council was about to learn how far humanity had risen. The Council Hall, once again filled with the same high domes and crystalline delegates, fell into complete silence when the doors opened. Mara Idris walked in alone. No guards, no entourage, no translators. Just a datapad tucked under one arm and the steady, confident pace of someone who had never known fear. She wore no armor, no medals. Just a simple suit woven from hybrid fiber earth cotton, reinforced with CX-9471 alloy threads. Functional, sturdy, and oddly elegant. When she reached the center of the floor, she looked up at the ancient beings who had sentenced her ancestors to die and calmly placed the datapad on the Council lectern. Without a word, it activated. The chamber was filled with images, massive underground cities glowing with geothermal light, forests of bioengineered plants growing in sealed domes, children running through clean corridors carved from solid rock, factories using molten metals powered entirely by renewable sources, defense satellites made from reclaimed holes orbiting in silence, schools, hospitals, culture, life. Mara's voice echoed through the chamber. 25 years ago, you exiled us. No trial, no appeal. You gave us nothing but a dead world and expected us to vanish quietly into the dark. She turned her gaze to the silent Council.
We didn't vanish.
We built. We learned. We adapted. Pointed to the projection and orbital map of CX-9471. Now renamed New Terra, marked with hundreds of settlements. You meant it as a death sentence. We took it as a challenge. Words struck like a hammer. Mara continued not with demands or threats, but with facts. She laid out infrastructure models, power output charts, survival rates, terraforming, progress, birth statistics, and technological advancements, all made without a single ounce of Council support. We will not ask for forgiveness. We will not seek re-entry. You made your decision, and we honored it. She paused. Then her voice turned colder. Do not think you can return now, just because our death did not come. You lost the right to our skies the day you sealed us beneath them. The Council was stunned. For the first time in living memory, they had been faced with a species that didn't plead, Didn't break, didn't seek favor. Humanity had looked at a poisoned world and said, "This will be ours." Out. Not through conquest, not through luck, but through will. Mara ended her speech with one final warning. We are not your enemies, but we will never again be your subjects. If you come to New Terra, you come as guests or not at all. Then she turned and walked out of the chamber, leaving silence behind her so heavy it felt like gravity. In the days that followed, the council debated feverishly. Some wanted sanctions, others whispered of war. But more and more species, especially those marginalized or cast aside, began to reach out to New Terra, not as beggars. The ripples from Mara Idris's appearance at the Galactic Council didn't fade, they surged outward like a tsunami. The once-forgotten planet CX-9471, a New Terra, exploded across every galactic news network. Even species that had previously considered humans irrelevant now paused, stunned. What they'd seen wasn't desperation or a plea for inclusion, it was power earned through suffering. Progress carved from extinction, and pride that refused to die, and for many across the stars, it was inspiration in the outer systems, those neglected by the councils. Bureaucracy rumors spread like wildfire. Miners on acid-washed moons spoke and hushed. Voices about human tech that ran for years without refueling, border-world smugglers, reported defense systems that could track ships through ion storms, entire species oppressed, censored, culturally erased, saw in New Terra a living symbol that survival in exile was not just possible, but a foundation for sovereignty. And the most revolutionary part? Humanity didn't claim dominion. There were no demands for planets, no calls for vengeance, no declarations of empire. Mara's speech didn't end with conquest. It ended with boundaries. We're not your enemies, but we will never again be your subjects. That line echoed louder than any battle cry. On New Terra, the world continued to bloom. Surface cities were now rising, protected by towering radiation, shields, and enclosed biospheres. With climate manipulation technology perfected underground, humans were slowly terraforming the surface, not through brute force machines, but through controlled biological re-engineering. The acid-laced snow now fed genetically tailored lichen. The air, once toxic, was growing breathable in pockets as atmospheric processors marched across the land like metal forests. Massive wind turbines and orbital solar arrays powered everything from homes to fusion foundries. Children played in light that humans had created. Families walked in parks, where once there was only black rock. They had not just survived. They had transcended it, back in the core worlds. The council teetered on the edge of existential panic. Their sentence hadn't killed humanity. It had forged them into something stronger. Quietly, council members debated everything from blockades to resanctioning. But they knew that another act of aggression could spark a crisis. They wouldn't survive. The humans weren't building war fleets or death rays. They didn't need to. They had built a narrative, one that no super weapon could destroy. A story etched into galactic memory, the species that was thrown into the fire and became the forge. And worst of all, they weren't alone anymore. Other species began aligning with New Terranaut, politically. Not in rebellion, but as partners. Refugee fleet from the shattered Yixari Confederation arrived, seeking asylum. New Terra accepted them, then helped them rebuild their broken ships. The Verente, long abused as a slave species by a council member world, sent envoys in secret. But the humans gave them medical aid and education. The Deloc Syndicate, infamous for scavenging tech, approached cautiously. Humans didn't just share schematics, they taught them to improve. Mara Idris called this the Second Genesis Protocol, not a crusade, not a movement, but a blueprint for survival by cooperation. New Terra wouldn't build an empire. They would build a mirror one that showed the galaxy what it could have been. It chosen challenge over control. Galactic historians would later agree the exile had been the Council's greatest mistake, not because it failed to destroy humanity, but because it gave them exactly what they needed: isolation, adversity, focus. They didn't die in the dark. They found themselves in year 30, a new fleet. Launched from New Terra not to conquer, but to explore. Sleek vessels crafted entirely from local alloys and human design, bearing a single, unifying emblem. It's a sunburst rising from cracked stone. It wasn't a declaration of power. It was a message of promise to every species abandoned, outcast, or exiled. By the great powers, you are not alone anymore, because the galaxy had changed. Where once there had been just Earth, now there was new Terra world that should have been a grave, but became a seed.